At the agreed time, Eleanor descended the grand staircase of the estate, dressed in a simple yet elegant gown that Victor had sent her. She knew he saw her only as a functional presence, a decorative piece meant to impress his guests. Yet, she vowed not to let herself be reduced to a mere accessory. Upon their arrival at the prestigious restaurant, the investors observed Eleanor with curiosity. Victor introduced her briefly, offering no explanation for her presence. She merely smiled politely and took her seat, attentively following the discussions unfolding before her. The dinner progressed, filled with animated conversations about financial markets and expansion strategies. True to Victor's instructions, Eleanor remained silent, until an investor questioned the project's viability. Seeing Victor hesitate, she suddenly spoke up, presenting a sharp analysis she had developed from listening to her employer work. Silence fell over the table. Victor stared at her, stunned. The investors, initially perplexed, began nodding in approval. One of them, impressed, remarked, "Your assistant has quite the eye. Where did you find her?" Victor, caught off guard, struggled to respond. Eleanor, however, met his gaze with a glint of defiance. That evening she hadn't just surprised the guests, she had redefined her place in Victor Moreau's world. The first minutes of the dinner were marked by formal exchanges and sharp financial discussions. Eleanor, obedient to Victor's instructions, remained silent, merely listening. However, as the debates progressed, she couldn't help but notice the hesitations and inconsistencies in some of the investors' arguments. Then came the critical moment. A silver-haired man questioned the solidity of Victor's project. He spoke of high risks, uncertain profitability, and concluded that the investment might not be worth it. Victor clenched his jaw, visibly annoyed, but before he could respond, Eleanor spoke. Her voice, soft yet assured, cut through the murmurs. "If I may, I believe you are underestimating a crucial factor." All eyes turned to her. Unfazed, she continued, delivering a precise analysis of market trends. She cited exact figures, demonstrated sharp insight, and formulated an irrefutable counterargument. A heavy silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, one of the investors slowly nodded. "That's an interesting perspective." Victor, still frozen, observed Eleanor with an unreadable expression. As they left the restaurant, he finally broke the silence. "Where did you learn all that?" She simply offered an enigmatic smile. That night she was no longer just his housekeeper. She had entered his world in a way he never anticipated. The investors exchanged intrigued glances. Mr. Laurent raised an eyebrow, visibly surprised by Eleanor's confidence. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" he asked, half curious, half skeptical. Without wavering, she calmly continued, "A project, no matter how solid on paper, always depends on the people behind it. The human aspect is often underestimated, yet it determines success or failure. An investor doesn't just fund an idea, but a vision, a dynamic, a united team. Without that, even the most promising projections remain mere numbers." A heavy silence settled over the table. Victor stared at her, torn between astonishment and an admiration he wasn't ready to admit. The other guests seemed unsettled, as if, in just a few sentences, Eleanor had shed light on a fundamental aspect they had overlooked. Then, unexpectedly, Mr. Laurent burst into laughter, not mocking but genuinely impressed. "Now that's a refreshing perspective," he said, raising his glass. "You're right, Mississippi. Too often, we let ourselves be blinded by Excel spreadsheets without seeing the essential." Other investors nodded in agreement. Victor, who had expected to fight to defend his project, realized that Eleanor had managed, in just a few words, to capture attention and shift the conversation to his advantage. As they left the restaurant, Victor walked silently beside her. Finally he turned to her. "I think I underestimated you, Eleanor." She offered a mysterious smile. "That's not the first time I've heard that." Eleanor did not hesitate. With disconcerting ease, she navigated the discussions, relying on her keen sense of observation and sharp intellect. She spoke about the importance of adaptability in an ever-evolving market and the necessity of visionary leadership. Every carefully chosen word captivated the audience, to the point that several investors engaged more with her than with Victor himself. Victor clenched his jaw, struggling with a mix of irritation and admiration. Never had he imagined that his housekeeper, whom he had always seen as just an employee, could establish herself with such elegance and intelligence in such a demanding circle. He wanted to regain control of the conversation, but the attention was no longer on him. Mr. Laurent finally set his glass down and declared, "Miss Eleanor, you have a sharp business acumen. Have you ever considered pursuing a career in this field?" A faint smile lit up Eleanor's face. "I've always been interested in the business world, but in my own way. Observing, understanding human dynamics and anticipating trends. That too is a form of management." One of the other investors nodded, impressed. "Victor, where have you been hiding this rare gem?" he asked with a laugh. Victor felt his irritation rising. He had wanted a discreet companion. Instead, he found himself facing a woman who was stealing the spotlight and worse, earning the respect of his own partners. As they left the restaurant, he couldn't help but give her a pointed look. "You crossed the line." Eleanor, unfazed, simply replied, "Or perhaps I redefined it." Victor felt the pressure mounting. He had come seeking financial support, not a debate on business ethics. Yet Eleanor had managed to captivate his audience in a way he never could have anticipated. Worse, she seemed to be earning their respect far more quickly than he was. One of the investors, a silver-haired man named Mr. Dubreuil, leaned back in his chair, intrigued. "You have a refreshing perspective, Miss Eleanor. Have you ever worked in business?" Eleanor gave an enigmatic smile. "Not officially, but observing and understanding how a system works is often more instructive than being directly immersed in it." Dubreuil exchanged a glance with Mr. Laurent before adding, "That's exactly the kind of thinking we seek in our collaborators, vision beyond just numbers." Victor, who had remained silent until now, suddenly straightened. "Eleanor is here as a guest, not as an advisor." His tone was sharp, almost cold. Eleanor didn't flinch. "I never claimed otherwise, Mr. Moreau. But when a question is asked, I believe it deserves an honest answer." Laurent smirked. "That's precisely what we appreciate, authenticity." The rest of the dinner unfolded under palpable tension. Victor, furious, felt his authority slipping away while Eleanor became the center of attention. As they left the table, Mr. Dubreuil discreetly slipped his business card into Eleanor's hand. "If you ever consider a new path, call me." Victor clenched his fists. This dinner, meant to strengthen his grip on his business, might have cost him far more than just a strategic advantage. A murmur ran through the table. Some investors exchanged amused glances, entertained by Eleanor's audacity. Mr. Laurent, however, displayed an approving smile. Victor, meanwhile, struggled to conceal his irritation. He disliked losing control, especially to someone he had considered merely an employee. Yet, he could sense that with every word Eleanor spoke, she gained more credibility in the eyes of his associates. Dubreuil spoke again, looking thoughtful. "You know, Victor, it's often beneficial to listen to those who aren't trapped in our corporate mindset. Sometimes an outsider's perspective brings unexpected solutions." Victor clenched his jaw but gave a forced nod. He couldn't afford to alienate these men he needed. Sensing the weight of the attention on her, Eleanor chose her words carefully. Innovation doesn't always come from the top. It often emerges from the overlooked details. A company that ignores its employees or its clients eventually loses what makes it unique. Laurent tapped the rim of his glass, reflecting. "That's a very fair point. Perhaps we should apply this approach in our own businesses." Victor felt the irony of the moment slipping entirely out of his grasp. He had hoped to impress these men with his business acumen, yet here he was, overshadowed by the very woman he hadn't even deemed necessary to introduce properly. The dinner ended in a strange atmosphere, somewhere between satisfaction and unease. As they stepped outside, Victor grabbed Eleanor's arm. His gaze was cold, but his tone betrayed a hint of concern. "What exactly are you trying to prove?" She gave him a slight smile. "Nothing at all, Mr. Moreau. I simply answered their questions." And for the first time, he wondered if he had underestimated her. Eleanor remained impassive, crossing her arms with a disconcerting calm. "I wasn't trying to monopolize the attention, Mr. Moreau. I simply answered the questions I was asked." Victor ran a hand through his hair, visibly annoyed. "You don't understand what's at stake. These men are investors, not idealists looking for pretty speeches about social responsibility." She raised an eyebrow slightly. "If that were the case, then why did they seem so interested in what I had to say? Maybe they're looking for more than just a return on investment." He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. Because, despite himself, he knew she wasn't wrong. Mr. Laurent and the others had been captivated, and that was no coincidence. After a long silence, he sighed, his anger giving way to something more unsettled. "You don't realize the risks of this kind of intervention, Eleanor. You could have compromised everything." She gave a small smile. "Or maybe I saved the situation. You may not see it immediately, but this dinner might just be the turning point you were hoping for." Victor stared at her, searching for any hint of hesitation in her gaze. There was none. Eleanor was more confident than ever. Finally, he shook his head and dropped into a chair. "You're impossible." She inclined her head slightly. "Good night, Mr. Moreau." Then she left the room with the same poise she had maintained throughout the evening. Victor remained alone, torn between irritation and admiration. Eleanor stood frozen for a moment, the phone pressed to her ear. Had Mr. Laurent really just offered her a job? His composed, almost benevolent voice contrasted sharply with Victor's brutal coldness the night before. "I was impressed by your wit and vision, Eleanor. I believe you have much more to offer than a mere housekeeping role. We could discuss the possibilities if you're interested." Her heart beat faster. She had never considered a career outside the domestic sphere, but after that evening she realized she had underestimated her own abilities. "I would be honored, Mr. Laurent." After hanging up, she took a deep breath. What should have been a crushing failure was turning into an unexpected opportunity. She finished gathering her belongings and left the manor without a backward glance. Meanwhile, Victor sat at his desk, staring darkly at the now empty spot she had occupied each morning. He couldn't understand why an unsettling sensation grew within him as the hours passed. He had thought he was rid of a problem, yet an inexplicable void remained. When he learned a few days later that Eleanor had joined Mr. Laurent's team as a social strategy advisor, a bitter smirk crossed his lips. She was doing better without him. Ironically, her departure had awakened a deep doubt within him. Had she really overstepped the limits, or had he simply never seen her true potential?